Turns out the archaeologist is not actually the archaeologist. They are in an office promoting a robot. And then I just noted cubed future food.
I know, I made a note of that too. I was like, that sounds horrible.
Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Herrenstein. With me, as always, is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
And today we are doing part 4 of 5 of Archaeology from Space by Sarah Parcak. And if you listened to the last episode, we had a pretty big, what the heck was this chapter? We weren't sure why we read it and thought maybe it would pay off this episode. So we're going to find out. But before we get to that, we do have a couple interesting things to point out. In the first episode of this, we learned about how early spy satellites, by the US at least, would drop film from space and they would parachute back to the planet where they were caught mid-flight by an airplane. And I thought that was pretty wild. Well, we both thought that was pretty wild.
Yeah.
And turns out our good friend Stingray Tom has actually already studied about this. And there's a lot he said, so you can go check out the comment yourself on YouTube if you like. But basically, they reached a near 100% retrieval rate with these things.
That's crazy to me.
Yes. And usually they caught it on the first try, but they were, moving 200 miles an hour and they could try several times if they missed. And then finally he just commented, he didn't give us a number, but like just thinking about the millions of dollars that would have been spent on this is kind of wild to think about too.
That's bananas.
Yeah. So that was really cool. I wanted to share that. Thanks, Tom, for giving us that info because I was kind of wondering. And then our other piece of news is Barbara and I were recently interviewed for another podcast, the Continuing Studies Higher Education podcast. And since we are in the higher education sphere, Barbara and I are through the work we do, then they asked us to come on and talk about the podcast we do.
Yeah, and we met them at the Podfest Expo down in Orlando that we went to earlier this year.
Yeah, we had a real nice chat. If you're interested in the podcast and kind of know a little bit more what goes into it and why we do what we do, then I think that's a great listen. I appreciated the hype.
Yeah, for sure. No,
we got from
great.
them, so it was nice to hear some nice things from them. So
yeah, and it was fun. And I think their podcast very interesting angle as well. So
agreed.
It was great to be able to contribute to that.
Moving on to chapter 8. We're doing chapter 8 and 9 today. And so the question of, did this chapter pay off from the previous chapter? No, not really.
No, not really.
I mean, there's still plenty to talk about, but the connection we were thinking, could have been there is not there, I'd say.
Yeah, there wasn't really.
There is, you can say there is, but it's not in concept. It's more in detail.
Yeah.
But I will say, this chapter had maybe a bit of a stronger theme or an idea it was trying to communicate compared to most of our other chapters.
Yeah, the association with the space archaeology is kind of tenuous.
Exactly. Yeah, that's definitely true.
Yeah, but the chapter itself did have a theme.
Yeah. So we start off talking about, how ancient cultures can inform our society today and the natural cycles of increasing and decline. And so this chapter is kind of the only real connection is last one was about kind of the end of the Old Kingdom, or the decline, I think is maybe a better way of putting it, of the Old Kingdom. This chapter is more about the rise of the New Kingdom, Yeah. And so specifically, she is searching for the lost city. I'm going to try this name. No, I'm not.
I mean, if you did, I wouldn't know if you were wrong.
Right. But I'm not even sure where to start. But it's an ancient Egyptian city that was supposedly lost, but it was the capital during at least part of the Middle Kingdom period. I wasn't sure if it was the whole period.
That's my understanding, although I'm not completely sure.
Yeah,
we're not Egyptologists.
Pretty important for the understanding of the Middle Kingdom era and everything.
Right.
And until recently, they hadn't really had any idea where it was at. So there was another archaeologist who found some traces of Middle Kingdom objects, and that gave them the clue kind of where to look. And then she used a combination of elevation data from the space shuttle. So the space shuttle apparently did elevation data of the entire planet in 1994. And so she combined that, made it into a 3D model, and then overlaid some other data over that so she could kind of see. And one of the things that is kind of cool about this sort of a thing, and I've seen people do this before, is you can exaggerate the elevation. And so you can make like very shallow trenches and stuff really stand out so you can see them better. And so she's able to do that and able to find, basically, if I understand it right, a channel of the Nile River that was unrecorded. They didn't know it actually ever went this way before.
That's the way I understood it. And I did a little Googling on the Nile River just because I'm not that familiar with it. And it looks like there's a bunch of tributaries that kind of come and go. And it's actually the main two tributaries are also, they have Nile in their name, but then there's a bunch of other little tributaries as you work your way down the river. And it's meandered over time like rivers do. And so a lot of like settlements that used to be on the river are no longer on the river. And, you know, things you would expect with river archaeology, I guess.
Right. And I imagine the Egypt side of the Nile is probably fairly low lying. And so that would mean it would probably shift position a lot more frequently too.
Yeah.
In that context. She gets a team together and they go to take some core samples of where they think this was going to be. And she talks about how this is a relatively small chance of success, these core samples. And that's, yeah, it's definitely something that can be a bit of an issue.
I mean, we see that with shovel testing.
I mean, shovel testing is just
core sampling, essentially.
Core sampling, not as deep, probably, I suppose.
I would assume.
It's probably very similar anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, so shovel testing, folks at home, is where we will actually take a pointed shovel, usually, and dig a hole, usually no more than like half a meter, so a foot and a half, I'd say, wide. And then we just take that down until we hit what we call sterile soil. So basically soil is old enough that people aren't there.
Yeah. And in Florida, that's about a meter deep. Sometimes you do end up with it being a little bit deeper, but standards in Florida are a meter. And in Egypt, because of the like alluvial sediment over time, they have to go much deeper because there's so much sediment from the river.
I've had projects because of erosion, we've had to go down 8 feet.
Yeah.
And that was not with a shovel test. That was, we had an auger, which is basically the same idea as a
core.
As a core.
Yeah.
It just doesn't pull it up in one long shaft like the core, I think, can.
Yeah, you won't be doing that in Florida.
No.
You'd be hitting water.
Anyway, then after they pulled up the cores, this was my interpretation again, I think they just water screened them because she describes it in a way that didn't name it as water screening, but it sounded like water screening.
Yeah. It sounds like water screening.
So essentially there's different coarseness of meshes, and then they put water over it so the dirt rinses through, and then things separate by size a little bit.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of what we do for water screening. Maybe we don't usually have multiple meshes, though.
No, but for most of our sites, it probably wouldn't be necessary.
True enough, yeah. Usually you just go with the smallest mesh you want, actually.
Yeah.
And then everything else would be caught anyway.
But I can see how having it like kind of tiered would be helpful.
And at some point, about 5 meters down, which is really deep.
That's so deep.
They hit a pot. So the pot is not themselves proof of anything, but it does give some indication that they might be onto something there. So that's something they're pretty excited about, and they need to just essentially investigate further to find out more, like you would have to do on any archaeological site.
Yep. So far, standard archaeology procedure.
Yep. So they're getting ready to excavate, and then they have to stop because essentially in that area at that time, looting has gotten so out of control that it's just not safe for people to be working there, and the Egyptian government has stopped issuing permits essentially for that purpose.
Yep, which when we were reading Stealing History, they kind of ran into similar issues.
Right.
But I like how she says, patience is the hardest part of archaeology.
And I always say, archaeology is not worth dying for.
Yes.
So.
For sure.
Anyway, so they return, and there's apparently a tomb that's been exposed. I'm a little unclear on this because this was all unknown before, but now there's a tomb that seems like it's kind of fully exposed, not by the looters necessarily.
Interesting. I took it to mean that it was exposed by the looters.
Okay.
But I don't know if I just kind of made that assumption.
I might be mixing that up with a different tomb.
Because of the context. Because I know they came back, and, this was after the Arab Spring, and that's what caused a lot of the looting. And she was super shocked by the amount of damage that had been done by the looters.
Right. And so their goal here is to essentially put metal doors on the tomb to prevent further looting of that tomb.
Yeah, because this is essentially, she refers to it as a cemetery, and I was having a hard time kind of picturing what this all looked like in my head. I wish there were maps or something that kind of showed the layout of the site, even if just generally, because I don't necessarily know what an Egyptian cemetery looks looks like and how people were laid to rest. And I know there's a lot based on, it was very much so based on your status within society. But to me, a cemetery probably looks a lot different than what she's referring to. So I was having a hard time just kind of putting some of this together as like a visual image of what was happening.
There is a discussion about pit burials, essentially, where essentially multiple generations would be buried in the same little pit.
Yeah.
But this is not that. This is a pretty high status person who had like a whole complex, essentially.
Yeah. But it sounds like looting was just crazy rampant. And
yeah.
I thought it was interesting that they were putting these little doors on, well, they weren't little, they seemed pretty significant actually, but on the tombs. I thought that was an interesting method to try and protect them.
I know that's been done in some cave sites. Mm-hmm. That makes even more sense to me because you're not going to break through a cave wall.
Right.
Tombs, I feel like if they're determined enough, they'll just punch out another spot or something.
Yeah.
But maybe that determination is enough to prevent most people from doing anything.
Maybe. After reading Stealing History, I'm not convinced.
Right.
But I don't know what else they would do besides just post armed guard at them 24/7,
right.
Which I don't know. It sounds like there was some guarding there, but it seems like it was mostly to protect the people doing the excavation.
Yes, agree. And then she tells us about the team she's got assembled.
Yes.
And this, I think, got our ire a little bit. She describes a core small team. She's kind of done this before, but it's not been quite as clear.
Yeah, so she talks about a group of people that they're locals, essentially, and I'm going to pronounce them Kuftis. It sounds like there's regional dialect differences, so it can be pronounced several ways, but I'll spell it too. It's Quftis. And they're archaeological technicians. They're archaeologists. They're excavation managers, foremen. They're very well trained. And from what I did a little research, they actually have invented their own techniques and stuff. So like they're very knowledgeable and they're like renowned, for their work. But I find it interesting because she doesn't refer to them as archaeologists, right? She refers to them as foremen, laborers, Kuftis, everything but archaeologists. But she does talk about how much she kind of appreciates their work and stuff. But when to me, it felt kind of colonial-esque, And so I Googled, as I do. And it turns out that there is a very, very long kind of legacy of what they would call, or you can call like invisible labor and underappreciation. And it's all based in colonialism. Imagine that. Go figure. But I guess it's starting to change, but they are archaeologists,
right?
They have, like she says in the book, I believe they have more local knowledge than a lot of the archaeologists that come from other countries to work at these sites. But
but why aren't we calling them archaeologists?
Yeah, then? And from what I can tell, it's all pretty much stems from colonialism, and they were treated as kind of like the air quotes hidden hands of Egyptology. They were the ones doing the work, and that's kind of what I also ran into is they don't write the books, they don't have the academic papers, and they don't have the degrees, so we don't call them archaeologists, but really they're the ones that are doing the work and they have the knowledge.
Well, if they're not archaeologists, most of the field crews aren't archaeologists.
Right, like think about when we were doing CRM.
I'm sure I was far less trained when I started doing CRM than they are.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
But yes, I want to point out too, to be fair to the author, it's not just her. It's a problem within Egyptology, and it sounds like things might be changing. But I mean, I actually looked to see if there were any papers published by them that I could find on the internet, like white papers and stuff, and I didn't find any. So
my white papers, you mean? Published, academic papers.
Yeah, academic papers.
But since we're talking about colonialism, I thought we should maybe clarify what white paper meant a little bit.
I mean, because if there was any, like I just searched for like, I forget the like keywords I used, but it was like Kufti published paper research or something like that. Nothing popped up. But how many books have we seen from Egyptologists, and how much of that work was done by the hands of these people? You know, so it was that kind of got me a little worked up.
Yeah.
But I do understand that it is not a problem that is originating from our author. It's a bigger problem.
It is kind of a norm that hasn't maybe been questioned or dealt with fully.
Yeah. And I was also, while we're talking about our annoyances, so she, at the beginning of the book, she talked about how archaeology has the ability to like talk about people who weren't written about in the books.
Yeah,
and,
that's true.
All this stuff. And then we keep going back to tombs.
Right.
And I'm like, and the capital city and all this stuff. And it's like
rich tombs.
Yes.
Rich people's tombs.
When are we going to talk about the everyday person in Egypt? That would, to me, be more interesting.
Yeah.
But again, I keep feeling like she keeps going back to the elite status people. But
well, I think, like I said previous episode, I think that's because she thinks that's what she needs to do to sell archaeology to people.
Yeah. But like also, and this could be me as an archaeologist, but like there have been 5 billion gazillion books written about, King Tut and the elite status individuals in Egypt and the gold tombs and the blah, 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 blah. I know absolutely nothing almost about the everyday person.
Mm-hmm.
That to me would probably spark a lot of people's interest just because that's not something we've learned about.
And presented in the right way, it will be interesting to people.
Yeah.
So anyway, they continue to investigate the place, find a fair amount of destruction, but they start to find certain kinds of destruction where they have real questions about when that destruction happened.
Right.
So there's some signs that this place may have been at least partially defaced, maybe back in contemporary with the burial. We never answer that question, and that's fine. We don't always get answers to those questions. But a lot of the focus here was on figuring out the name of the person who was buried there. And I get that that can be like a thing to look for, but is that the thing to look for? Right?
Yeah.
And I can see how that can be useful because we do have records. Maybe you can tie this person into those records in some way. So there can be value in that, but that doesn't seem like, it seems like a small thing.
Yeah, to me, the question of when this looting occurred is more of an interesting question because I think that can tell you a little bit about like the social dynamics of when it may have occurred, what was occurring if it did happen within early Egyptian history, what was going on politically that would cause that. Stuff like that to me is more of an interest.
The trade goods that are present and what does that say about trade networks? And, there's a lot of stuff in there. But a lot of this, of course, still comes down to a wealthy person, which is kind of back to our core issue of like, we want to hear more about the everyday person.
Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons why the word cemetery piqued my interest is like, okay, well, who were all these people? Where, what was their status and stuff? And
a little credit, I think, to them here too. In this context, they are excavating this tomb specifically because it was such a target.
Yeah.
So if it hadn't been a target, maybe they would have been talking about the more everyday ones.
That's fair.
So that's worth keeping in mind as well. But it is also a pattern we've seen kind of throughout the book. Towards the end, they use a total station and GPS. So a total station, you might see road crews using this on surveys. Sometimes we use it in archaeology because it gives extremely accurate location points of data if you do it right.
Right. Yeah.
It can be kind of fiddly, I've found when I've worked with it before. But based off of this, they identified over 800 tombs. And this was when she mentioned a lot of those were the pit tombs. And because many of these tombs will have multiple people in it, they estimate they have like maybe 4,000 people present with maybe another 1,000 tombs that are undocumented still, which is a lot.
Yeah. No, that's pretty impressive.
That's quite a lot. Yeah. Especially when you started off not knowing about any of them. That's kind of a big deal. And then we close off this chapter by bringing it back around to the original idea about how people talk about the Old Kingdom collapsing, and she pushes back on that. And I appreciate that a lot, actually.
Yeah. No, I we've seen this now in several books, which gives me hope.
Yeah. So she talks more about its decline and the rise of the Middle Kingdom. And then she talks about how this is a cycle that we see in societies and cities in the past. And we should maybe applying this and taking a look at our own societies, which is cool.
Yeah. And so one of the things I did appreciate is how, I'm sure you've had this where you tell people you're an archaeologist and they're like, oh, you just study the past. And a lot of people don't necessarily think of it as something that's relevant to today. And I do appreciate how she talked a little bit about how archaeology can be used in planning for current issues we're having and future planning for, climate issues and stuff like that. So I did appreciate that.
Yeah, and like I think we touched on a little bit, just how societies naturally have their patterns.
Yeah, they ebb and flow.
Our societies are going to have those same patterns. We're not immune to that, and understanding how that goes and what kind of things trigger these changes can only be beneficial to us. And this is the exact territory we've covered already in Annalee Newitz's Four Lost Cities, actually.
Yep.
And if this idea grabs you, then you can check back in our feed because we've done 4 episodes covering that book in the past that talks all about this concept. And if you're enjoying 2 archaeologists digging into popular archaeology books, hit follow so every new episode lands for you on the 1st and the 15th. All right, so that chapter was maybe one of our more focused ones. The tomb didn't really have anything to do with the core concept, though, so maybe I'm backing off that a little bit.
It was a little more focused.
Yeah, this was so far we've had chapters I didn't like and chapters I liked pretty well, and this was okay.
Yeah,
I'm not enamored with it, but it was okay. There was still some space archaeology in there. And then we get on to our next chapter, which I gotta say, Barbara, was pretty tightly focused.
I'm sorry. This chapter was so weird, Tristan.
So this chapter is titled Future of the Past. And it starts with like 4-page sci-fi story.
I was like, what is happening? Because I was thinking like, she's tried to do like the narrative storytelling before, but we thought it was random then. Mm-hmm. And this is like off the charts. Random, weird. But yes, tell us, Tristan, all about this story.
So this is supposedly takes place 100 years from now. And essentially the archaeologists are all by themselves and they have dig bots, which are basically little drones that zip off and do all the remote scanning in just a few seconds. And then with instant analysis and actually instant like hypotheses and stuff generated too. So no human is involved in that anymore.
And then there's like different robots and they're different colors and they do different types of scans and different type of, like there's one that I guess put probes in the ground, right?
And there's some that are actually digging too.
Yeah. So it's very
near instant DNA.
Yes. Which with the whole DNA thing, I was like, I wonder how that would go over like robots collecting DNA from human remains, how that would go over with like tribal consultation.
Oh boy. Yeah. And then like instant 3D model was generated of the temple, I think that they were looking at. There's actually quite a bit of like disparaging the archaeologists rolling around in the dirt in the past that we do today.
And one thing that got me was like at the beginning of the chapter, she's like, so far I've told you a lot about how we use satellites today. And I was like, but have you really?
Well, it's been there. I'll say it's been there.
And I kept, and like, how the person, what was the name? Robbie, the future archaeologist, they have to give these little robots commands. And they were like, go yellow, go digbot. And I just kept thinking of like Power Rangers or Captain Planet or something. It was weird.
Yeah. One of the reveals here is UAV comes to pick up the archaeologist and turns out the archaeologist is not actually the archaeologist. They are in an office promoting a robot on site.
Yeah, they have like little avatars or whatever.
And then I just noted cubed future food.
I know, I didn't notice that too. I was like, that sounds horrible.
Yeah.
Why is it that in all our futuristic like movies and books and stuff like that, we're eating like cubes of food or whatever? Like I want my future food to be like super delicious and super colorful and not a cube.
I mean, sometimes it's dystopian kind of a future they're imagining, and sometimes it's kind of a natural extension of the highly processed foods, I think, too.
Yeah. No, I want my food to be real food and not in the form of a thank you, unless it's tofu.
And then at the end of this little story, it's revealed that this archaeologist has applied to go on a exploration ship to be an archaeologist in space.
Like a real space archaeologist.
Yes, of other of other non-human civilizations.
Yeah.
And that is the story.
Yeah.
And I will say, it's all pretty well focused on the future of the technology.
Yeah.
This whole thing.
Well, and the whole report that it spewed out, and they were upset because it had only it was like 2% inaccurate or something. And I was like, and they were like, oh my gosh, my boss is gonna be so mad that they really wanted it to be 1%. Like, this is so weird. So weird. And like, just the whole thing. To me, this is dystopian. Like, I know that's not how it was meant. It was meant like, oh yeah, technology is cool, but I'm like, oh, this sounds horrible.
I think it's meant to be a little, because she does talk about how she's talked a lot about how she enjoys the digging and everything.
Yeah, that's true. But it's kind of like, it would be unfortunate to lose that. And it's like, I don't necessarily take that as dystopian. I take it as like, oh, well, that would it would be different, or whatever. Whereas I'm like, ugh.
I got it I got a stronger sense from that. Mm-hmm. Like something would seriously be lost if we don't have that connection to the place anymore.
Yeah, that's true. She does talk about that.
Which I feel like there's a conversation to be had there, but I also feel like people making these comments very easily sound like they're ancient when they talk like that.
Oh, yeah. Kids back in my day.
Yeah, we don't even have to dig anymore, I don't know.
I used to walk 2 miles uphill in the snow both ways.
Carrying our screens. Yeah. All right. So let's stop picking on the book. Let's try and get into some of the actual archaeology here. Interestingly, so this was written in 2019, and it's only 7 years old, and some of these are pretty out of date already.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
It's kind of amazing.
Well, and she does say that, like, technology is changing really, really fast.
Yeah, this is no shade on the author either. She's given us stuff at the time and predicting the near future, and it's like, no, that's already happened. So drones and UAVs are coming a long way. At that point, they were becoming fairly common, and we're getting multiple pieces of equipment on them. I think we're very much well on the way for that.
Yeah. I thought the thermal infrared imaging was pretty interesting, and how you can use that to discern like different temperatures at archaeological sites, and we kind of figure out where things are based on their temperature. And she kind of compared it to how urban temperatures, like asphalt, will retain heat differently than soft soil or and stuff, and how we can kind of use that information to help us identify sites. That's cool.
That's cool, yes.
And I guess it's already been done some. Do you have more information on?
No, I don't. That's the first I'd heard about that, I think, but it makes sense.
Yeah,
because sidewalks are hot.
Yeah.
We'll also be able to use more than just the few infrared bands that we can use. There's a whole bunch of other color spectrums that we can start to use. This is something we've talked about before. I forget. It's the little phaser thing that tells us the chemical makeup.
PXRF?
I think she's talking about PXRF here.
Yeah, I noticed that too. She called it something different, but it seems to be, and I don't know, there might be different methods of collecting that data.
Yeah, it might be an entirely different technology to something very similar.
But it's really cool.
Yeah, so PXRF is something we've talked about a bit before. I'm not an expert in it, but I know a kind of gist of it. It has different forms, like the bigger lab versions to the handheld stuff in the field, but essentially you hit an object with lasers, I think.
Yeah, some type of X-ray laser situation.
Yeah, and essentially different atoms will generate different light.
And isn't that what our office is a historic building, and isn't that what they used when they were testing it for lead too, or was that different? Because I was just wondering if people may have seen it in that context.
I don't know, actually.
I know he had like a little shooty thing, a little laser gun thing.
That would make sense if that's what he did.
That might be a place where you've seen it in like non-archaeological context.
Right, but you can imagine the value of that for archaeology. We might not have to lick the bone anymore.
Oh no! What are we going to do? We won't be able to be so weird.
Right.
We'll have to find new ways.
Freak people out so easily. We'd have to try harder. She's predicting quicker data, which, I'm sure. Ultrasonic mapping. Actually, I didn't look this up, but there's actually been in the news recently where they've been able to scan rolled up and burned or charred scrolls.
Yeah, that was
read the
cool.
content. And so she's talking about that here. That's been in the news just in the last month, I think. And then we get to machine learning, which it's wild to think that this whole concept of AI taking this data and spitting something out for you with very little effort on your part was so foreign just 6 years ago.
I know, right?
And this is wild, yeah.
And now you can Google something and you can put it in AI mode and it just spits out stuff for you.
Yeah.
Like,
so this is pure sci-fi when she's writing this.
Yeah.
Well, not pure, because scientists have been using statistical models for a long time. And it's same same idea. AI, as we use it now, is, as I understand it, statistical model for generating text.
Yep.
So it's a similar idea, just, much more accessible now. She does talk about how we're nowhere near actual digging tech.
Yeah.
I did notice a few entries in the recent Lego mechanical competition
I was
trying to help us out with that.
say that too.
Yeah.
I was like, these kids think we're close. Well, and I had a lot of kids talk to me about, as the climate warms and you're doing outside work, would a robot help make the archaeologists safer?
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that was interesting. And she didn't really, I guess she kind of hit on that a little bit, is like, how the climate change could affect things. But I thought that was an interesting concept. I had one group that wanted to make a climate controlled suit for the archaeologists to wear. And as someone who's worn a whole Tyvek suit, I was like, as long as it's not Tyvek.
It was climate controlled, air conditioned.
So gross, especially in Florida. That stuff was not made for Florida.
It would be air conditioned though. This one would be.
It would, yeah. They said it would have a little air conditioning and humidity control and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, we're onto something.
I saw a fair few entries that were about health monitoring too,
Mm-hmm.
like hydration monitoring, that kind of a thing. It's we just look at the color of our pee, so this would be an improvement.
Well, and I think it's important too, because there have been archaeologists within recent years who have either gotten severely ill or have died due to heat stroke and stuff like that. So
it is a hazard for sure.
Technology may be able to help us with that. We don't necessarily want to lose the digging. We all, like she says, we love the digging.
Mm-hmm.
But if there's stuff that can make digging more comfortable and maybe a little easier on our knees,
that would be good.
There was a lot of talk about DNA analysis too. And I know the first thing that always comes to my mind is the indigenous groups and how they would feel about this kind of stuff, which I already hit on. But that's something that, as she was talking about it, I was like, I wonder what their...
And that maybe doesn't apply to someone in Egypt. Well.
No, not in Egypt, but even in Egypt, when I was learning how to say kufti, I learned that there's different dialects and, they may have populations there that would feel different ways about this.
Right. Yeah. And then if it's instant, there's not a real opportunity to consult.
Right.
And that's a problem.
How would this affect mermaid there?
Yeah. In theory, this would happen slow enough that we would figure it out as we go.
Well, and I know a lot of times it's the work has to be done by a credentialed archaeologist, but if it's robots doing.
Mm-hmm.
But she does talk a little bit about how in the future she wonders if archaeology is going to be more of a subfield within a technological field, which I thought was interesting. So archaeologists would get degrees in some tech-based thing, and then archaeology would be a subfield, a sub-study underneath that.
Necessarily understand it that way. I understood it more we already very multidisciplinary in other ways, and she thinks tech might become more and more important in one of those ways. That was kind of my understanding.
Okay.
Because, we use a lot of chemistry, but we're not chemists.
Right.
Right.
So I understood it as you'd have a specialization within tech for archaeology.
Or maybe a tech specialization within archaeology.
Well, she called archaeology a sub specialty or something.
Okay.
So I
don't know. We'll have to find out.
I know.
We did talk about 3D modeling and printing a bit.
Yeah.
Which is one of my favorites. She talked about how that's come a long ways, and it's still come a long ways. And she also talked about how she wondered if the replicas these might get so perfect that it ends the looting.
Yeah, I thought...
And I'm like, I don't think that you understand the motivation for looting.
And I feel what it's going to do is create more of I don't know if market's the right word, but for fraudulent sales,
I don't care about that.
I don't care either, but how there's a lot of knockoffs that are sold as tourist tchotchkes, or, people try to fake the real thing and make money off of it, which if you're going to buy a fake thing thinking it's real, I really don't have any sympathy for you.
Right.
But
like we talked about in actually
Stealing
in
History. Yeah. But
no, Relics.
Oh, was it in Relics?
Yeah. Well, Stealing History maybe too, but Relics is the case where they had the fakes they're producing and selling.
Oh, yes.
And there was some of the characters were wrestling with morals of that. And we were like, meh.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. I don't have any sympathy for them, but I don't know that it's going to end looting.
I don't think it understands why people loot.
Yeah.
It's because they want the thing.
Yeah.
And they're always going to want the thing. Even if they can't tell it's the thing, that's what they want.
Right. They can tell others that they got things.
Right. And then there's some thoughts about actual space archaeology with aliens, which, sure.
Well, I think it was interesting, maybe a little cool that she brought up that archaeologists kind of have the skills necessary to study other extraterrestrial cultures. imagine applying for those permits.
Right. There might be some three-dimensional paperwork.
Right?
She does talk a bit about the existing theories about aliens and stuff, and just straight up calls them as racist and bigoted, which, if you want to hear more about that, we covered that a lot in Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries.
Mm-hmm.
That was an excellent book. Highly recommend that one. You can get a cheap copy to read. Highly recommend reading it, but we had a fun talking about that one.
Yeah. And I appreciate that she brought that up and realizes talking about this as an archaeologist and talking about, archaeology in space, she kind of got the irony of talking about how cool this is and then being like, also, oh yeah, there already are like a lot of conspiracies that deal with something similar. And I'm glad she kind of clarified that in this book.
Yep. And then kind of there's a little bit of wrap up for this chapter, and I just like the phrase, I am obsolescence in action. That was pretty good. Basically that, as we go through life, we clearly become more and more obsolete, like cursive.
Well, I had a professor in undergrad tell me that archaeology and archaeologists are the result of an affluent society, and to never forget that society will continue on without you. And I was like, okay. Yep. That's what you want to hear as an undergrad.
Right. So that's our reading today. This last chapter felt like it should be the final chapter.
I know. When I was reading it, I was like, and we're done. And I'm like, oh, no, wait, we're not.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious to see where these next chapters go, because I don't know where you go from this.
You'd finish with the last, what's the future of this stuff, usually think.
Yeah.
But I will say, even though it started off extremely strange.
It was super weird.
It was a lot of like
contemplating.
Yeah, and it felt like a lot of contemplating without actual basis a lot of the time.
Yeah, it was like
pie in the sky.
Yeah.
Not all of it, but some of it was. But despite all that, I will say this was a very well focused chapter.
I mean, yeah, it just seems. Can I say it seems out of the blue?
Yes. Barbara and I are currently talking about what book we might do next. We've got a couple lined up, but if you have any that you would like us to include that you think we should cover, do send them that way. Drop in the comments, give us an email, whatever you want, and let us know, because we're always open to suggestions from folks.
And you can also find us on Goodreads too.
All right, so next time we'll finish up with chapters 10, 11, and 12.
All right, happy reading, everybody.